The officer who came to my door that Tuesday morning was younger than my son-in-law. He had that careful, practiced expression they must teach at the academy. Neutral, professional, just a little bit apologetic. He looked at me standing in my own doorway in my flannel shirt and said, "Mr. Ashby, we received a call." I told him I was the one who made it. That's where I'll start. But to understand why I picked up that phone, you have to go back about 8 months, back to the morning my daughter sat across from me at my own kitchen table, wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee like she owned the place. Because by then, in her mind, I suppose she did, and slid a folder across to me, with a smile I hadn't seen since she was 16, and trying to talk me into letting her borrow the car. I'm 67 years old. I retired 3 years ago after 31 years as a licensed electrician in Sudbury, Ontario. I worked union my whole career, paid into my pension, bought my house on Cambrian Drive outright in 2008 after my wife passed and I cashed in some RRSPs I'd rather have left alone. That house is mine. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a garage I converted into a proper workshop. I know every wire in those walls because I ran most of them myself. My daughter, she's 34, moved back home in February of last year. She called me from outside in the driveway, which I thought was strange. She'd driven up from Hamilton with her husband and 2 overnight bags, and she was crying before I even opened the door. She said they'd had to leave their apartment. The things had gotten tight, that her husband's import business had run into some cash flow issues. She asked if they could stay for a few weeks, just until they got back on their feet. I said yes without thinking twice. She's my daughter. I've been saying yes to her since she was born. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's the only thing he was to me, had always been the kind of man who shook your hand a little too firmly and talked about money in the way people do when they don't actually have any. He'd started some kind of import venture 3 or 4 years back, bringing in goods from overseas, he said. Electronics, tools, that sort of thing. He talked about it the way people talk about lottery tickets. Always just about to pay off. Always one deal away. He was pleasant enough to my face, helped clear the table after dinner, held doors open, called me sir the first few months. But I noticed things. Small things. The way he'd walk through my workshop like he was appraising it. The way he started suggesting I should look into putting the house in a family trust for tax purposes, he said. The way he started using the word we when talking about the property. We should think about the driveway. We might want to redo the insulation in the roof. I let it go. I'm not a confrontational man. I spent my whole working life in trades, and you learn to pick your battles when you work with the same guys in the same bucket truck for 20 years. I figured he was just the kind of man who said we when he meant himself. By June, the few weeks had turned into 4 months. My daughter had found some remote work doing bookkeeping. She's always been good with numbers. And my son-in-law was apparently still managing the business. I never saw much evidence of it. What I saw was him at my kitchen table until 11 in the morning, on his laptop, speaking in low tones on his phone and closing the screen when I walked by. I started locking my workshop. Then, in August, I noticed something off with the mail. I have a box at the end of the driveway, nothing complicated. But twice I came home to find it already open, mail already sorted. He said he'd just grabbed it for me. I said thank you, and didn't mention it again. But I started checking the box earlier. One afternoon I found something addressed to me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost threw it out. I get a lot of junk from insurance companies. But something made me open it. It was a letter from a collections firm in Toronto. It referenced a business account in my name, a commercial line of credit. The balance listed was $380,000. I sat on the porch steps and read it 4 times. I have never in my life opened a business account. I don't have one. I'm retired. My only accounts are my checking, my savings, and my TFSA at the same credit union in Sudbury where I've banked since 1987. I know every single thing with my name on it because after 30 years of being careful with money, being careful is a habit you don't lose. I didn't say a word that evening. I made dinner. I watched the news. I went to bed. The next morning, I drove to my credit union before they were open and waited in the parking lot until the manager unlocked the door. His name is Ted. I've known him for 15 years. And I sat across from him at his desk and told him what I'd received. He pulled up everything attached to my name and SIN number. There was nothing on his end, but he recommended I call Equifax and TransUnion that same day and request a full credit report, and he said I should also call the OPP fraud line. I did both before noon. What the credit report showed me was this. Someone had opened 2 accounts using my name, my date of birth, and my home address, a business line of credit and a secondary credit facility tied to the same business number. Together, they were sitting at just over $390,000. I didn't sleep that night. I went to a lawyer the next morning, a woman who practices out of a small office on Elm Street. Been there for years. She looked at the documents, looked at me, and said very calmly, "Mr. Ashby, this is identity fraud. Do you have any idea who might have had access to your personal information?" I told her I had a strong suspicion. She told me not to confront anyone, not yet, and to let her make some calls. I drove home and made lunch like nothing had happened. I sat across the table from my son-in-law while he talked about a deal he was this close to closing, and I nodded and said, "Is that right?" and ate my sandwich. What I have never told anyone until now is that I nearly said something right then. I felt it sitting in my chest the whole meal. This weight, like a stone sitting on my sternum. Because part of me still didn't want to believe it. Part of me was still hoping there was some other explanation. Maybe a mistake. Maybe someone else entirely. My daughter refilled my coffee without being asked, and I looked at her and thought, she has her mother's eyes. And I thought, she has to know. I went back to the lawyer 3 days later. She'd spoken to a contact at the OPP fraud unit and had a clearer picture. The business credit had been opened using a combination of my personal documents, SIN, date of birth, home address, plus what appeared to be a fabricated business registration in my name. The contact listed on one of the accounts was a cell number I didn't recognize. The business address was listed as a unit in a commercial building in Hamilton, which is where my daughter and her husband had been living before they moved in with me. Hamilton. My lawyer said, "We need to file a formal fraud report before you do anything else. Do not engage directly with whoever did this." I said, "Understood." I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what she told me. I filed with the OPP. I filed disputes with both credit bureaus. I spoke to a second lawyer, a civil one, about the potential implications for my property if creditors came after me. He told me that because the business was registered separately and the debt hadn't been secured against my home, the house itself was likely protected, but that I needed to get the fraudulent accounts flagged before any of that changed. The whole time, I came home every evening and ate dinner with my daughter and her husband. I am not a man who shows what he's feeling unless he chooses to. That, too, is something 30 years in the trades teaches you. You learn to work through discomfort without broadcasting it. You learn to keep your face neutral when you're 40 feet up a lift in January and the wind is cutting through everything you own. My son-in-law gave me no reason to think I suspected a thing. It was a Wednesday morning in October when it finally broke open. I'd just come back from my morning walk. I do 4 kilometers every day. Doctor's orders, good for the back. And I came through the side door into the kitchen. My daughter was at the counter. My son-in-law was sitting at the table with his laptop open. He looked up when I came in, and something shifted in his expression. He'd been expecting me later, I think. He said, "Actually, good timing. We need to talk to you about something." My daughter set down the mug she was holding. She didn't look at me the way a daughter looks at a father. She looked at me the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to solve. He opened the laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a document, a repayment agreement, formatted to look official. It had my name at the top. It laid out a schedule for repaying a business debt totaling $387,000 to be addressed through a lien registered against my home. I stood in my kitchen in my coat and my boots, and I looked at that document for a long time. My son-in-law said the debt had gotten out of control and that there was pressure from investors. He said the house was the only realistic asset that could back a refinancing arrangement. He said it could all be structured quietly, no courts involved, keeping it in the family. He said the investors were not the patient kind. I asked him what would happen if I said no. He leaned back and glanced at my daughter. He said it wouldn't be good for any of us. He said the business was registered to me, and that made me liable, and that the simplest resolution was the one sitting on that screen. My daughter said, "Dad, it's the only way." I looked at her. I thought about her mother. I thought about her mother. I thought about the house I bought in 2008. I thought about 31 years of being careful. I said, "Give me a day to think about it." He didn't like that. His jaw tightened. He said they needed an answer soon, that the timeline was tight, that they'd already spoken to a notary who could come to the house. I said, "Tomorrow." I drove straight to my lawyer's office. I didn't call ahead. She was with someone, and her assistant asked me to wait, and I sat in that waiting room for 22 minutes, staring at a framed print of Lake Superior on the wall and holding my hands perfectly still in my lap. When she came out, I said, "They showed me a repayment agreement. They want a lien on the house." She closed her office door and said, "Then we're ready." What ready meant was this. The fraud report had been active for 12 days. The OPP had an open file. My lawyer had already drafted a formal letter to my son-in-law's last known business address, laying out the fraudulent account activity and demanding cessation of all claims made in my name. We had a paper trail. What we had been waiting for was them making a direct move, and now they had. The next morning, I told my son-in-law I needed to speak with him and my daughter together at the kitchen table. I poured myself a coffee. I sat down. I put a folder on the table between us. Inside was a copy of the OPP fraud case number, a copy of the credit bureau disputes, a letter from my lawyer, and a formal notice, a 60-day eviction notice under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, properly served, which my lawyer had helped me prepare because even family members who occupy your home acquire tenancy rights after a certain point, and I'd wanted to do this correctly. My son-in-law looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. His face did something complicated. My daughter said, "Dad," I said, "I know about the accounts. I know about Hamilton. I know about the business registration. The police have been involved for 2 weeks." I paused. "I want you both to leave my house." He tried to speak. He started a sentence about misunderstandings and working it out. I let him finish, and then I said, "My lawyer will be in contact. If you'd like to contest the fraud allegations, that's your right, but this conversation is done." My daughter looked at me across the table. Across the table in my house, in the kitchen where she'd grown up, under the same ceiling light I'd wired in 1994. And she said, "You are really doing this?" I said, "You should have thought about that before you put my name on a $400,000 debt." The officer who came to the door 2 days later wasn't there because of me. My son-in-law had apparently called the non-emergency line to report a dispute over housing. The officer was young, careful, a little apologetic. He listened while my son-in-law explained, from the driveway, that they'd been asked to leave and felt it was unjust. Then the officer asked to speak with me. I showed him the eviction notice. I showed him the fraud case number. I showed him the letter from my lawyer. He looked at everything. He looked at my son-in-law. He said very politely that this appeared to be a civil matter with active legal proceedings, and that he'd recommend they seek independent legal counsel. They were out by the end of the month. The fraud case took longer. These things always do. The OPP worked with the financial institutions to trace the account openings, and my lawyer worked with the credit bureaus to have the fraudulent entries removed from my file. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't painless. And there were weeks where I'd open my mailbox and feel my chest tighten before I'd even looked at the envelopes. The civil case is still unresolved as I write this. My lawyer tells me we have a strong position. The criminal investigation is ongoing. I was told not to go into specifics here, and I won't. What I can tell you is that the house on Cambrian Drive still belongs to me. I was out in the workshop last Saturday building a small cedar planter box for the front step, something I'd been meaning to do for 3 years but never got around to. It was cold, the way October in Sudbury always is. That particular sharp cold that comes off the Canadian shield and doesn't apologize for itself. The space heater in the corner made a sound like it always does, a low, unsteady hum, and the wood smelled clean under the saw. My daughter has not called. I don't know if she will. There's a part of me, the part that still remembers her at 7 years old, asking me to teach her to ride a bike in the same driveway. That hopes she does someday. There's another part of me, the part that sat across the table from her while she told me signing away my home was the only way. That isn't sure what I would say if she did. What I know is this: I am not a weak man. I am not a foolish man. I am a man who loved his daughter enough to let her move back home when she needed help, and who trusted that love enough to let things go too long. That's not stupidity. That's what fathers do. But there is a limit, and when someone puts your name on a $387,000 debt without your knowledge, signs fictitious paperwork in your name, and then sits in your kitchen and tells you to hand over your house quietly, you find out very quickly where that limit is. Mine was that kitchen table. The cedar planter is finished now. It's sitting by the front step, painted a dark green that looks good against the gray of the stone. I filled it with soil last weekend, and I'll put something in it in the spring. I haven't decided what yet. Something that comes back every year.